Welcome to Qualified Opinions, where we test the ideas and limits, the knowns and known unknowns around freedom and order in contemporary politics and society. We invite you to listen as we engage with leading and emerging thinkers across disciplines and issues who will sharpen our thinking on the topics shaping our discourse.
The new right, the old right, American conservatism, national conservatism. How do these versions of conservatism fit together or oppose each other? To talk about this, I'm delighted to welcome Charles Kesler to the podcast. We will discuss his most recent article over at the Claremont Review of Books called National Conservatism versus American Conservatism. Charles is a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute, the editor of the Claremont Review of Books, and a distinguished professor of government at Claremont McKenna College. Welcome, Charles.
Thank you, Vero. There are a lot of Claremonts in there, aren't there?
Yes, there are a lot of Claremonts and there are a lot of conservatism, which is kind of challenging for my French mouth, as it turns out. So let's start. Can you tell us? So we're going to be talking about this article that you just published, and I really recommend that everyone reads it. But before, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to actually study or become an expert and a scholar in the conservative tradition?
Well, it is by now a long story, which I don't want to bore your listeners with, but I'll give you a very condensed version, which is that in my youth, I was a great fan of William Buckley. And I managed to meet him almost by accident, although it took a certain bumptious quality in myself to arrange it, when I was 16 years old, and he was visiting southern West Virginia, which is where I'm from, giving a lecture at a college near me. So I wrote him as the editor of my high school newspaper and requested an interview because I was a great fan of his. I watched Firing Line. I had read all the Buckley books. I was totally up on the Buckley phenomenon and a great fan. So he was kind enough to respond, although only at the last minute. So I figured the meeting was never going to happen. But on the day before his lecture, he sent me a telegram, which is still the only telegram I've ever received. You know,
I think you've received one more telegrams than me. That's still one
yes,
more.
Well, they've sort of gone out of fashion. But the Western Union van and a man wearing the Western Union hat and the costume got out and handed me a telegram, which said, "Meet me after the lecture, and we'll do the interview in the car on the way to the airport," because like a rational person, he was trying to get out of West Virginia as quickly as possible after his duty was finished. And so we had a nice long chat in the car, and then his plane was late. So that led to a bit more of a chat at the airport, at the end of which he offered to write me a letter of recommendation to Yale, which was his alma mater. And I was thrilled by that. And in the chain of correspondence that grew up out of our meeting, I sent him my interview and he sent me comments and so forth. It was very nice of him. He agreed to write a letter for Harvard as well as Yale. And in fact, I went to Harvard, not Yale, which was a great thing because I didn't realize at that time, which was 1973, 73, how much better Harvard would be for me than Yale could have been, just because of the faculty who was there at the time. And so rather luckily, I stumbled into going to Harvard at a sort of golden age, the last gasp of a lot of really wonderful professors who retired shortly thereafter. So I was very grateful to him, and we became friends. I worked for Bill for one summer at National Review, and we wrote a book together called Keeping the Tablets, Modern American Conservative Thought, which was a sort of greatest hits package of conservative writings circa 1980 1988. So at the end of the Reagan administration. And the point of the book was to sort of revisit the principles of conservatism after 8 years of power in Washington, to see what had been achieved, what had been compromised, and what needed to be worked on. And it was, I think, a very good book, and it remained a kind of statement which a lot of young people read and learned about conservatism from for the next 2 decades, probably.
So in that book, can I ask you a question actually about that, your assessment of conservatism after 8 years of Reagan? Because was this a book that was assessing the evolution or the progress that the philosophy, that the movement had made? Or was it more like an assessment of the policies implemented by the Reagan administration, and to see how much they were consistent with the principles that the conservative movement had defined as their principles?
That's a good question. The answer is it was primarily a philosophical taking of accounts.
Okay.
It didn't really talk about what the Reagan administration had enacted policy-wise, or how those initiatives had fared. It was really about the matrix of ideas out of which Reagan and the administration had come. And looking forward as best we could, to the world after the Cold War was going to be like, and what the world after Reagan was going to be like politically.
And what was your assessment in terms of what the Reagan administration had achieved for the movement? Really?
Well, it had. We didn't know, of course, in 1988 that 1989 was going to happen. That is to say that the Berlin Wall was going to fall next year, and that the Soviet Empire would fall, shortly thereafter. But we did have a sense that communism was on the defensive, and that it was the self-confidence of the free world was greatly enhanced because of the successes of the Reagan years, essentially. So we sort of figured, I guess you could say, that much work was left to be done on the domestic front, because the state and the growth of the state had not really been reversed. It had been tempered briefly, but not reversed, and certainly not, the state was not shrunken in any way by the Reagan years. But the economy was in much better shape. The free market was in a better condition. Entrepreneurship had sort of been rediscovered, and the heroism of the market had been rediscovered and restored in many ways. And also a new kind of patriotism had been instilled in the American scene. And all of that we counted as great goods. We thought that the most of the work really left to be done was domestic rather than foreign. I think that's wouldn't be an unfair generalization.
So I promise we're going to talk about your article because it's all related, but I have a question for you, because when I think about America, and before I came and after I came, one of the things that was striking for me as a French person was this real sense of patriotism that existed in the US. And was it, I'm just asking this because of what you just said. Do you think, was it the case that there wasn't such a strong sense of the image of America and the pride of being American, the sense of patriotism? Was it changed under Reagan?
We had lost the Vietnam War and had been essentially left ignominiously from Vietnam, and that the protests of the New Left in the 60s were still ringing in our ears. American morale had taken quite a tumble from the 60s to the 70s, and the state of our foreign policy after 3 or 4 years of President Carter was also perilous. Afghanistan had fallen to the Soviets. Iran had fallen in the Middle East. The Ayatollah was now ruling. The radical Islamists were in charge of Iran, and thus their influence in the Middle East was greatly enlarged as a result of all that, as we know today still. And so Reagan himself, in his farewell address in 1989, took credit really for two things. One was restoring the economy, and the other was what he called the new patriotism, this new sense that America was not only on the winning side, but deserved to be the winning side, and that there was, rather than a force for evil in the world, rather than a sick society, America really was a pretty healthy and good society, and that we should be proud of that. So that, yes, but I would say this, though. In the farewell address, he says he celebrates this new spirit of patriotism, but he also says it had not been institutionalized, and that you might say the big remaining problem from his agenda was precisely that young parents today, he said, don't know what to teach their children about America. They don't have a vision of an America that is unambiguously or unambivalently, he said, good. And I think that's still our situation today. In a way, the biggest issue in our politics is, what do you teach about America? What do you think about America itself? It's in some ways the central issue, at least in our politics.
Yeah, and actually, this is a good segue to start talking about your article, because there is really a sense that there is a movement to break with the conservatism of Buckley and Reagan. And so this article is called National Conservatism versus American Conservatism. So let's, for purpose of our listeners, maybe you could start with a few definitions. So what do you call national conservative? Who do you call the national conservatives, and who do you call the American conservatives?
Well, that's a good question. And the sort of dean of the National Conservatives is a very interesting man named Yoram Hazony, who is a PhD from Rutgers and a BA from Princeton. He was a student of Robbie George at Princeton. That will mean something to some of your listeners. And he's an Israeli who has created something called the Edmund Burke Foundation. And national conservatism is a project, you might say, a political or ideological project of the Edmund Burke Foundation, which is headquartered, I think, in Washington, D.C. So national conservatism is an international movement, paradoxically. There are British and German and French and Italian and Hungarian and all sorts of other forms of national conservatism, but their spiritual headquarters, in a way, is in this Edmund Burke Foundation and with Yoram Hazony. Mm-hmm. But many very smart and eminent conservatives have signed up to the statement of principles of national conservatism. Christopher Demuth being one of them, who used to be the head of the American Enterprise Institute for a long time and is now working for the Heritage Foundation. He's a very bright guy, and he usually presides at the annual conferences that the National Conservative Movement holds. But a lot of other people, friends of mine, many of them, some of them good friends of mine and old friends of mine, signed the statement. When I was asked to sign my name to the Statement of Principles of National Conservatism, I was tempted, but I did not sign it. And this essay in National Review is sort of a way of thinking through my reservations against signing it.
So I assume the American conservatives are you, and what are the others?
Yes, right. Well, the American conservatives represent, I think, or try to represent at least, the Buckley and Reagan conservative movement at its best. And that includes a lot of some traditionalists, a fair number of libertarians, and all those people who are both traditionalist and libertarian, who made up the Reagan's regiments, as he calls them, in his farewell address. The populist movement behind Reagan and behind the earlier forms of American conservatism, because both are populist in a way, maybe slightly different ways, but they both were anti-establishment. They both opposed certainly the liberal establishment of the day, but even to some extent the Republican Party establishment of the day.
And I will recommend the book by Matthew Continetti called The Right, if you want to actually kind of also understand where these American conservatives, the Buckley conservatives, where that movement started and how and what it was in opposition to, which is also fascinating to actually read this evolution. And so let me ask you. So in your article, you point to things that the two movements have in common. You have this great phrase, which is these two new rights, because the old Buckley New Right called themselves the New Right. These two new rights have many things in common, though no one would ever mistake Donald Trump for Bill Buckley. I thought it was a good line. Yes. So can you tell us what these it's things that they have in common?
Well, as I understand them, they are both, as I said, populist movements, that is, movements to rescue the cause of self-government and limited government from an establishment that has become hostile to it. And that establishment is, in its pure form, you might say, is modern progressivism or liberalism, as we call it often in America. And that they're opposed to that, but they're also opposed to the liberal Republican establishment, whatever that means exactly. When in the 50s, in the 1950s, when Buckley was creating the conservative movement, that liberal Republican establishment meant Nelson Rockefeller and Dwight Eisenhower, you might say. But in our terms, in more modern days, it represented the Republican Party after Reagan. It represented the Bush, the McCain, the Dole, and the Romney, you might say, families.
Is that the neocon side of the conservative movement?
Yes, but it was larger than the neocons. Okay. The neocons were part. They joined the first generation of neocons. Irving Kristol, Norman Podhoretz came into the conservative mainstream beginning in the 60s. But the second generation, Bill Kristol and John Podhoretz and others who populated the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, and some of them even earlier, the H.W. Bush administration, were a part of that post-Reagan conservative development, you might say. But so what these two rights have in common, these two new rights you asked me about, one is their hostility to many of the politicians, the donors, and the political consultant class in the Republican Party, the mainstream Republican Party, which tends to be, if not liberal, then at least open to liberal kinds of influences, meaning left kinds of influences. The difference between, you might say, Reagan and his vice president and his successors was captured in the anecdote, which is apocryphal, but I think is still revealing, which has Nancy and Ronnie sitting together listening to George H.W. Bush's inaugural address. And when he hails, as Bush did, a kinder, gentler America, supposedly Nancy turns to Ronnie and says, kinder and gentler than who?
Exactly.
Because the whole idea of a kinder, gentler America, kinder, gentler conservatism was a kind of criticism of Reagan for being too far right and much of what happened in American politics after Reagan on the Republican side was trying to correct the party and move it more to the center. That's what a lot of those presidential candidates, failing presidential candidates, had in common.
I mean, notably, the Bush administration had the compassionate conservatism
Yes,
program.
exactly.
Yes.
I mean, a real continuation of his father's critique of Reagan and his brand of conservatism as, 1,000 points of starry light, as H.W. said.
But so in the end, they're quite different. You write, our new right charges the old new right with certain errors. So can you talk about this?
Yes, and so today, if you think of the many young people on the right who call themselves New Right, as well as that subset of them who call themselves National Conservatives, the two are related, but they're not identical. What they think is that the old right, the Buckley right, the fusionist right, it's sometimes called, which tried to fuse traditionalism and libertarianism together, that whatever it's
On economic, only on economic issues.
well, it was broader than economic issues, but it ended up being primarily about economic issues. That's part of the criticism of the new right, our new right, the young new right, of the old right, that their libertarianism dominated their traditionalism, and as a result, America moved left in the last 20 years pretty steadily on the moral and political front. I mean, we moved from, sort of family policy to gay rights, but gay rights is really quite, old fashioned now. Now it's the trans right. And there's been a sort of relentless march ever leftward on a lot of those issues. But on the tax rates are still low, and much of the Reagan agenda in economics is still intact and still popular on the right, but too popular according to the young right, which thinks that it has its own kind of critique of neoliberal, to use one of their words, neoliberal capitalism.
It's interesting because effectively on the economic front, they're blaming conservatives for being too free market. So on that, they really have moved. They are the one who have moved left. And in fact, a lot of their positions are positions that you find on the left too.
Yes, that's right. They identify, deindustrialization, the loss of manufacturing jobs in America to China as a result of what they would regard as a naive free trade policy under Clinton and the second Bush, George W. Bush, as well. And yes, they have some very old-fashioned criticisms of capitalism, which were nurtured on the left, although not, I would say, exclusively on the left, but mainly on the left. And these two new right movements have their economics is not exactly in common. Their populism is in common. I think there's a populist element in them, but also they have an impatience with the academy and a sense that the academy is increasingly disloyal to the American idea and to the both the traditional and the free market version of the American idea, and the sense that the culture is moving rapidly left, putting a lot of pressure on politics as a result.
So do you think there is still some adherence to free market ideas?
Yes, there is some.
This new right? Where do you think it fits?
Yeah, it's a good question. The national conservatives officially approve, you might say, of the idea of the free market, but they say it can't be absolute. It has to be interpreted in the context of a national community, and the conservatism needed to keep a national community together and healthy.
It's kind of interesting because it's not as if we've ever had an absolute free market or ever really lived in a absolutely free market world, even on trade, right? I mean, just get the book of tariffs and regulation and trade regulation. I mean, it is everything but an absolute or unfettered, like they like to say.
No, and that's right. And
regimes.
But the truth is that free trade in America has been the principle of both parties at different times and in different ways. And before the Civil War, free trade was the principle of the Democratic Party. And after the Civil War, it became the principle. Well, it was shared really by both parties, but it became increasingly a Republican principle.
But it didn't mean, it's one thing to say that they believed in free market and they believed in free trade. It's a very different thing to say that this is the world we lived in, that in fact the world around us and our trade was free. It's entirely free. It was freer than it had been, and it was certainly guided by a lot of free market principles as a result. But there's a difference between the two, right?
The signal difference is this: that Alexander Hamilton, who in a way represents the tradition of high tariffs, protective tariffs, and so forth in American history, he knew his Adam Smith very well. So he didn't think that protection was the truth, and low tariffs and free markets was an error. He thought that Smith was right, but that circumstances in a young country, a poor country like the United States, meant you had to make an exception to the general utility of a free market trade policy and a low tariff trade policy.
I would go back. I would go back to the number of tariffs we had under Hamilton at the time of Hamilton versus the ones we have now. That's a trade I'd make really happily.
Oh yes, but that's in part because he didn't believe that the high tariffs, was the right policy or the universal policy. It was the prudent policy for America, but it was also the case that America would benefit from free exchange of goods that we don't ourselves compete with or make, and getting them at the lowest possible price from the producers who have advantageous terms in the world market. So he had sort of the best of both worlds, you might say. But as the Secretary of Treasury, he did propose some protective tariffs, and he proposed some bounties too.
Yes.
To stimulate infant industries and other things in America, the armaments industry and other kinds of things which are necessary.
I want to ask you a question about nationalism.
Yes.
How does the NatCon statement of principle actually defines nationalism?
Well, that's a good question, and it's a difficult question to answer in a way, because when you're talking about an international argument for nationalism, it rules out any one country's version of nationalism. It rules out, the you might say the ordinary meaning of the term nationalism, which is every nation has its own view of its advantage and its character, and tries to insist on that view. And instead, the NatCons talk about the idea of the nation, and it's there where I think the interesting questions and maybe the confusion begins to come in, because the idea of the nation sounds more like European nationalism than it does American nationalism. American nationalism has always been exceptional when compared to most European embodiments of nationalism. It's not that all European nationalism is throne and altar nationalism, the nationalism of the old regimes of the late 18th century and the early 19th century. It's not that, although sometimes European nationalism is throne and altar kinds of nationalism. But most Europeans believe that the nation comes first. I mean, chronologically, culturally, there's a people that shares a language, a religion, often a heritage, and that politics ought to be the expression of that nation, that pre-existing nation. And the idea of the nation state is that every nation deserves its own state. So, but it's one per customer. So Czechs and Slovaks, it turns out, don't really want to be in the same nation. Each wants its own nation state. And so they had a peaceful mutual secession from each other in the 20th century. And sometimes the secessions, of course, are not so peaceful. But that notion of nationalism is different from America's. American nationalism is consistent with the principles of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. That is, it starts from the notion not of a people or a nation, but of the individuals who compose that nation. And these individuals have rights, which come not from government or from the nation, but from God or from nature. These are the natural rights spoken of in not only the Declaration, but so many political affirmations of that period.
I mean, that's something I wanted. I mean, this is an important point because I wonder how the people on that NatCon, the signatory that are Americans, I wonder how they reconcile all of this, because the American conservatism and the importance of the Declaration and the Constitution take such a big place in the way we conceive of who we are and how the world, works, and our relationship to the government. That I wonder how they reconcile this with the national conservative movement. And then it's because you said natural right. Edmund Burke was very much into natural law. But Azani, if I'm not mistaken, is skeptical about it. So I just wonder how people reconcile all of this in their heads.
It's interesting because the statement of the national conservative principles is it's a joint statement, and so you can see that there is ambiguity in many of its provisions. There is obviously some difference of opinion among the signers. Some compromises had to be found. Some wording that papered over disputes had to be found. And so it doesn't take long to discover that some national conservatives are more American and others are less American, you might say, on this question of natural rights, limited government, social contract, all those ideas that underlie the Declaration of Independence and American nationhood, really. And so for us, the nation is something created by individuals who come together, in a social contract. And that nation doesn't necessarily have the same religion. It may not even speak the same language. It may encourage lots of immigration of people who have very little in common with the earlier immigrants who have arrived in the society. And so America has always been a bit of a melting pot, willing to have, to take on the challenge of sort of assimilating people from all over the world, and speaking different languages and coming with, in some cases, almost nothing except the clothes on their back, but wanting a chance to succeed and to live in a free country. And both opportunity and freedom are what they're after. I mean, it's not just a matter of getting rich; it's also a matter of being free. And those are, they're two sides of the same attractiveness of America and the American idea. And I wrote this piece out of an anxiety, you might say, or an uneasiness that the NatCons, for all of their, internal compromises and so forth, don't really do justice to the principles of America and to the exceptional quality of American nationality and freedom. That they're moving us along towards a kind of European style nationalism, which is fine if you're European or a European country, but it doesn't explain America very well. And I think it also de-emphasizes America's contribution to the world. I mean, the success of America ought to mean something to how one thinks about nations and nationalism. It ought to stretch those categories in a liberal or individualist direction, in a natural rights direction, if you want to call it that. And that is, from their point of view, the natural rights assumptions are many of them at least would say they're part of the problem rather than part of the solution. It's the excessive individualism that, in their view, has broken down nation states and conservatism in the modern period.
So in order to try to kind of see how they reconcile this notion of nation as it is for American conservatives versus this notion of nation that seems very disconnected from what America is. So if you asked most national conservatives whether some nations are more successful than others, what do you think they would say? Or do you think they would say that in the end, it doesn't really matter what kind of regime is in a given nation? All that matters is that nation is supreme.
Well, it's a good question because they in effect admit that there are some nations, not every nation, they admit, is capable of self-government or equally capable of self-government. So it's possible that there are nations incapable of nationalism in their sense. And I would say there are also nations that are not satisfied with nationalism or whose nationalism takes a more imperial direction. I mean, there are countries, Russia itself, modern Britain in the 19th century, and others who were sufficiently good at governing themselves that they aspired to govern other people too, or other nations too. And so it seems to me you can't leave it at every nation for itself, because not every nation conceives of itself as one of many equal nations in the world. Some of them conceive of themselves as more than equal, as fit to rule others. And there may, I can't think of any offhand, but there may be some that are bashful and are really not interested in ruling themselves. They're happy to be ruled by someone else. I think there are fewer of those, to be sure. But yes, their view of this is that not all nations are created equal, and some are more fit to wear the mantle of their idea of the nation. But at the same time, and this is, I think, what you're pointing to, there's a kind of contradiction, because national conservatism presupposes that most nations are capable of being conservative. That is, they're capable of ruling themselves in a reasonably decent way, and that their traditions, their religious and constitutional and moral traditions, are good enough to be an equal nation in the world, but not so good that they aspire to be, more than equal, an unequal or a potentate in the world. And one of my criticisms is that this kind of national traditionalism, this reliance on the tradition of every nation to be enough to guide that nation morally and politically, I just don't think is logical. Because there are bad traditions and there are good traditions, and not every nation's traditions are going to be so good. So you've got to have some standard, some principle outside of tradition itself by which to judge between traditions and to judge the different parts of a tradition. So in the United States, you could say, we have a tradition of slavery, and we did for more than 200 years. but we also had a tradition of anti-slavery. And so which one is good, which and ought to be our tradition going forward, so to speak, and which one ought we to reject as immoral, traditional, but not good for ourselves?
And this example actually is a really good one where it shows that what is old or what is old is not necessarily what is good, and what is modern is not and replaces the old is not necessarily what's good. That's bad. What's bad
is what bad. No, that's exactly
because
right.
a lot of what they're opposed to, right, seems to be an opposition to some form of modernity or things that replace tradition. But as you said, it's so much more complex than this.
Yes, I mean, what they oppose is, you might say, the dissolving acids of modernity, which eat away at traditions, good and bad, and which don't provide a substitute for the kind of moral guidance that people and countries are looking for and need. And they're not completely wrong about that. I mean, I think it's true that it's hard to be a 21st century country is in a way very difficult, because you can't look back to your traditions simply or easily. You do have to make some kind of defense of them. You have to try to show that they're good, that they're moral, and you need a standard by which to make that argument. And I think that one of the big problems of nationalist conservatism is that not every nationalism, not every brand of nationalism is conservative or is good, is moral. I mean, you need more than that.
So let me ask you, for the American side of the national conservatives, where does American exceptionalism stand? Is that something, because is it something that is still has a place, is valued?
It is something that is acknowledged by some of the signers and some of the authors of the Statement of Principles. And that's why there is, as I say, there's disagreement among the national conservatives really about how to think about America. Some of them are much more comfortable with American exceptionalism than others. And for those who are not very comfortable with it, they think America is partly a victim of these universalist ideologies of the 21st century, liberalism being one of them, rights being one of them, human rights being one of them. But at the same time, they also think that we're not just a victim, but that some of them at least think that our founding principles are themselves more a part of the problem than they are a part of any possible solution to the problem. Because after all, the principles of the Declaration, all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator, with rights among which life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those are very universal rights claims, rights doctrines. And if the enemy of good politics is universal doctrines, then we might have to plead guilty to being an enemy of good politics. But I don't think that follows, because not all universalist doctrines are equal. I mean, they're not all the same. Marxism is a universal too, but it's not true in the same way that individual rights are true and healthy. And it's the opposite of healthy.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that I find striking about this movement, especially as someone who came from France and really admired the true patriotism that existed in America, and this real sense of no matter what differences we have, we share this love in our country and in our tradition. What I find weird about this movement is their reverence and admiration for foreign leaders. I just have never seen this in the 25 years I've been here. I mean, whether it's Hungary with Orban, and I mean, it's unsettling. So what do you think some national conservatives
not to say Putin, by the way, some national conservatives have this fascination with Hungary.
Well, Hungary is an important case for the national conservatives because it's one of the most friendly nations to them and to their movement. But that's because I think it's Orban has consciously called himself and his country an illiberal democracy. That is, it's a democracy, but it shuns the most universalist fads of modern human rights doctrines and the EU's especially interpretation of those kinds of doctrines. And I mean, I'm sympathetic with that. I think Hungary has a right to be Hungarian in its
absolutely.
conservatism and even to be traditionalist where traditions are reasonable and the kind of and many of the moral traditions they're appealing to are, reasonable natural law, natural rights doctrines, Christian doctrines, some of them, of course. We're in a part of the problem which has brought forth the reaction of national conservatism is the trendiness and the relentlessness of modern rights doctrines. So, if you don't honor the latest claims of rights, whether it's ranging from transgender rights to other kinds of sexual liberation, and also socialist kinds of doctrines of the right of everyone to support from the nation, from the government. Human rights advocates these days have a bad habit of saying, if you're not with us on the very latest cutting edge things, you're not serious about human rights. But there are a lot of human rights that aren't changing or changeable all the time. Life, liberty, property, very basic things, which seems to me you ought to be able to defend in the name of human rights without being assailed because you're not with the civil rights movement or the human rights movement on its latest enthusiasms.
No, I agree with you, but I do wonder, like, for instance, like a lot of us are looking at the National Conservatives' fascination with Hungary and its government to say that I'm puzzled is an understatement. Mm-hmm. Because in the end, while I totally agree with you that, no one should be imposing these new versions of right, the reverse is also true. In a way, a lot of what Orban is trying to do is to impose through illiberal policies his version of right and wrong, right? And one of the things that was beautiful about the American experiment is actually it was a place where there was it seems a minimum that we could agree on and respect other people's and their differences. And that basically using illiberal means to achieve even a good end was not something that was acceptable. And it seems that again, it's my understanding of the American experiment, understanding of how we live together. The NatCons are kind of saying, the hell with this. This tolerance in a way gave us, what all the things that we don't like.
I hear what you're saying. I think that there is some division within the NatCons about these questions, and in a way, they are trying to make a distinction between, you might say, the French Revolution and the American Revolution. Both had versions of universal human rights principles, and the French one results in a kind of imperialism to spread that version to other countries who have not consented to it, and of course to refound their own country in a kind of relentless way and start the calendar from the year one over again and so forth. And the Americans have a much more reasonable and prudent version of human rights, which we have not entirely consistently, but more or less stuck to since then. Of course, we had the terrible problem of slavery right in front of our eyes, too, in a way that France did not have. French slavery was in the colonies overseas, not at home, as ours was.
Arguably, some of the French slavery or some version of that went on for way longer, right? Between French Algeria wasn't.
Well, yes, it was at least formally abolished before American slavery was, I think.
Yes, yeah,
but it may have gone on.
It was in the same form of slavery, but it was not great.
Colonialism and some,
exactly.
some variety or another, whatever that means exactly. That's kind of a word requiring a definition, but difficult to define. I would say I agree with the National Conservatives that there is a danger from modern universalist fads, whether driven by the United Nations or the EU, and sort of bureaucratic government in support of those fads that reasonable people ought to object to and to resist. But I don't think that such resistance requires pledging your trough entirely to tradition. I think you have to keep reason and rights and limited government and all that follows from those principles in your sights as well. And that they're not optional exactly, they're fundamental.
Yeah. You highlight in your paper one of their problematic recommendations, and it is, I think it's from their statement of principle, where a Christian majority exists, public life should be rooted in Christianity and its moral vision, which should be honored by the state and other institutions, both public and private. Can you explain why you think that's problematic?
Well, it's problematic because it doesn't define where Christianity ends and its moral vision begins. If you can distinguish those things, I think the statement is more defensible, more reasonable. But if what they're talking about is state support of religion in something in an active way, sort of akin to what in 18th century America was not uncommon in many states or many colonies, that I think is wrong-headed. I think America has a very vibrant or reasonably vibrant, maybe not as vibrant as it was 20 years ago or 30 years ago, religious culture, and which means majority Christian culture, because Christianity is not established as an official state religion. And I don't think it's wise or good to imagine that so establishing it would be a step forward, either for the nation or for the religion. I think it could be bad for either or both.
Yeah, I think there's no better way to kill religious sentiments than have the state try to enforce it.
Yes, that's more like the French understanding than the American one,
Yeah. No, and it's kind of interesting. Let me find, you talk about, I want to find, you do talk about that their notion of nation in a way is so much closer, right, to the Rousseau European type. Yes. And that's a recurring theme. And that's one of the things that, while I can't pretend that I understand the whole project, because it's really a project, rather than even a movement. One of the things that actually worries me is precisely the fact that they sound way more like the Europeans and like the French and like a lot of things that I really do not like. I've left France and came to the US precisely because having so much run through the states is actually a really bad idea. It's bad for morality. It's bad for economics. It's bad for all of this. And this is just really, I think, ultimately where I could never, you're way more generous towards them than I can be. It really is ultimately really something that weirds me out, to say the least.
Right. Well, I understand that argument, and I share it to a point. I mean, they don't really say much, actually, in the statement of principles about protectionist economic policies. They attack, they reject the notion of socialism, which is good. They also say that the free market is not an absolute, and that we have to interpret economic questions in the context of what's good for the nation and what fits the nation and its needs. And that statement is not immoderate. I mean, it's not far from actual American practice for a long time, which has been generally free market. But Ronald Reagan had steel tariffs, and Milton Friedman may not have agreed with that, but he tolerated it because he understood the political argument for
and
it.
Isn't this actually just the right-wing version of what the left is doing now? Because who defines, right? They're going to be, if this becomes the system that's embodied in the way we do politics, right? It's all well and fine when they're in power, but when they're not in power, or when they don't hold the main institutions, right? We get the system, we get what we have now. This is a lot of the left operates like this, where they think that ultimately their understanding of what is good for the country and what the country should look like, and they're trying to push it through all sorts of different venues of the state, like different policies, different dictates, and of course you have what happens outside of the state through universities and the media and all of this. So it seems to me that it's just basically it's trying to kind of, I take their criticism of the current system and what they don't like. I get it. There's a lot I don't like either. But the way their answer to this is to say, we're just going to produce our own strong government imposed vision.
Certainement. That's the danger. There is I would say free trade as such is a policy rather than a principle. If you look at American history, I mean, there are very conservative presidents and counselors who called for protectionism, and there are very liberal ones or progressive ones who were anti-protectionist and more free trade. But it seems to me that the country has been willing to have either, to adjust its trade policy to meet what is politically expedient under the circumstances and conducive to, a stable democratic political order. But I would resist adopting protectionism as a principle that should be the default setting of our economic policy or our politics. There's a lot of the Republican Party itself, of course, was always the high tariff party, and its predecessors, the Federalists and the Whigs, that was their America First policy back then, the American system, as it was called. But they were willing to indulge in tariffs and even bounties, but they didn't make that a kind of rule. It was as often, it was more, I would say, an exception to the rule, the public rule, than it was a new rule. And I think that I'm comfortable with that. I think that's a reasonable position. But cronyism of the sort you're pointing to is, of course, the other side of it. That's the danger. If you make it a rule, you will soon have cronyism, because you're going to have ins and outs, and you're going to have interests that succeed in getting protection, and at the expense of others that don't get protection.
And that's one of the other inconsistency on the economics front. And obviously those two things, their notion of nation and then the policies are two somewhat separate things. But
But on the economic front, it's like they claim they're opposed to cronyism. It's more like they're opposed to some businesses, right? They have their issue with big tech. They have issues with Facebook and Google's and the likes. But a lot of the policies that they want in practice, they would actually lead to cronyism. Industrial policy is very often takes the form of cronyism, a protectionism, as you said. It's protectionism all the way, unless it's like actually what President Trump wants, which is a 10% tariffs on everything, and then you create enormous economic destruction. But at least it's on everyone.
Yes, that's right.
But so it's there's just this kind of inherent contradiction. But I want to ask you, because our time is running out. I'm really truly enjoying this conversation. When I was reading your article, and again, I come from a place where I don't I'm still learning the American history and history of conservatism, and I was struck by you have a list of all the many of the different flavor of conservatism. You list a few. So Paolo, conservative, neoconservative, religious right, Reagan's regiments, civil society conservatives, leave us aloners, national greatness conservative, big government conservatives, compassionate conservatives, Sam's Club Republicans, Reformicons, Tea Partiers, and so on and so forth. Yeah. And I was thinking, it's interesting. It's kind of like when people say, if you're Asian or it's like as if all the different Asian countries were the same. By reading this, I was thinking, wow, I was guilty of this, to kind of actually think that there's, one type of conservatism. And when really there's always been really just a lot of version of conservatism. And as you explained, they tended to join forces on the stuff they were against. What do you think is going to happen with this new movement, which is pretty aggressive towards American conservatism? It's like they're really have really harsh words towards that side of the movement. Do you think that there are ways that you can join forces on some things, or do you think it's going to be just basically a civil war of sorts?
Well, I don't think it will be a civil war between American and nationalist conservatives, because I think I'm not sure how many national conservatives there are in America. I think there are probably many more old-fashioned American conservatives than national conservatives. And I think they agree on many issues, or at least they will be able to cooperate on many policies that threaten America as a nation and as a free people. There are plenty of bad influences out there to want to oppose, or to have a duty to oppose. I do think that one of the big dangers, though, is that I think the best thing about American conservatism, in a way, is how constitutionalist it is, and how central to the very best of conservatism in the country has been a love of country based on a love and understanding of the principles of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and as explained in the Federalist Papers, and so forth. And it seems to me that when you have nationalist or populist conservative movements, one of the first things you ought to worry about is losing that constitutional anchorage. Mm-hmm. Because if America doesn't maintain that patriotism linked to those principles as really the core of its being, I think America begins to slip away, and we lose what really does make us exceptional and exceptionally good and promising and reasonable, moderate, and so forth. Most of that comes from the constitutional tradition, the moral tradition that accompanies that constitutionalism. And if we're just one nation among many others, and all these nations are more or less equally qualified to by their traditions to be models then I do think that we're losing something very precious, or in danger of losing something from American constitutionalism that helps to make it an American conservatism. And I don't want to see that happen.
No, I'm with you, and I absolutely am with you. So I have one more question. I could talk with you for 20 more hours, but I have one more question. What is like one of the biggest mistake or mistaken claim that you hear or that you would like to correct on this issue? And you can take this question however direction you want.
Yes, I would say here's one thing about the national conservative argument that troubles me, or even you might say annoys me, and that is the way, not so much the older figures in the national conservative movement, but the young people who imbibe national conservatism freely, and who might call themselves new right more so than national conservatives. These people, young people especially, who in general, I would say, spend too much time on the internet and have a kind of skewed view of the world, but that's true of a lot of young people these days. They diminish the figure of Bill Buckley and the figure of Ronald Reagan and the movement that they both sort of contributed to. Buckley more as a founder, Reagan more as the quarterback who took it finally into the end zone and got the win for it. And I think they dismiss them too cavalierly and too confidently. And they really ought to try to learn from the precepts and the example of Reagan and Buckley, and not dismiss them as antiquated and as with the weak sisters of a movement in which they imagine themselves to be the heroes. But they haven't really, we did win the Cold War. We have had success finally, even against affirmative action and the worst kinds of the civil rights movement excesses and moralism. Even on the abortion question, it's taken a long time. 1973, when Roe was passed, was a long time ago. But this steady, principled opposition has gotten us somewhere. We've made progress. The Supreme Court has finally seen the light on that question. And that doesn't mean that all problems are solved politically about abortion. It means a whole new set of problems now appear. But they would be wrong to think that the older conservatism never won anything, that they were losers. They like this phrase, this rather haunting phrase of Samuel Francis, which they applied to Buckley and Reagan. That is, beautiful losers. That these they're beautiful, and they're attractive, they're noble in some respects, but they were losers. And that I just think is wrong. And so short-sighted and so misleading.
And never mind that these guys pushed an economic agenda that make this country to this day the richest country in the world. And there's this I don't know, trend, and people think it's hip to try to pretend that somehow the US is like in economic decline, and it's been really just not the great deal that we've been saying it was. And it's utter nonsense. Utter nonsense, and it just baffles me. And anyway, so this we could go on for a long time. Thank you so much for this conversation. I really, truly enjoyed it. And everyone, please go read this article, National Conservatism versus American Conservatism. It's a fantastic article.
Yes, merci beaucoup.
Bye. Thank you.
Very nice talking to you.